Welcome. Well, you're an important part of our EWTN family, and you are at home with Jim and Joy. And we would be delighted to hear from you. So send us an email with your question or your comment to jimandjoy@ewtn.com. Well, today we are representing to you all a show that we did a while ago. Her name was Melissa Ohden. Melissa is an abortion survivor. So she survived a saline abortion late term. She was adopted. She lives to tell about it. It's just an unbelievable story.
It really is. Her abortion procedure went over almost a 5-day period, the process of attempting to kill her. Late-term abortions, there's a lot of preparation work for that. It usually takes 3 days before they actually do the abortion. So Melissa survived 4 to 5 days of being aborted, and she lives to tell about it. And tell about it she does. And you'll hear the story of her thinking about her mother who was aborting her, and then her grandmother was involved in the situation, and then she was born alive. Was she going to be left to die in some closet, some room, and put in a bucket? How was her life spared? Who spared her life? How did she survive and live after this, knowing? What is it like to have an attempt on your life for 5 days to kill you? An innocent, helpless human being. When you look in Melissa's face and all the love, the mercy, the forgiveness, and she's a mother now herself, and hear her tell her story, when you hear Melissa speaking about gathering abortion survivors, because there's more and more people who have survived abortion, boys and girls who survived, and she gathers them together as a community of love and care and forgiveness and mercy. You know, when we first saw the show that we did some time back, when I watched the show and I looked in Melissa's face and saw the woundedness, the hurt, but yet the mercy and love and power that was in her to forgive, to see her like coming back from the dead and speaking exactly what the abortion industry doesn't want. But she comes back and speaks, a survivor, and gives mercy. I said, you know, Joy, if we just did that one show, and that was it for some reason, we did no more shows, that would have been enough. And so we're going to bring to you Melissa Ohden today. You're going to hear her testimony. It's absolutely incredible, and you'll never be the same. So we now have the privilege of looking into the eyes, into the face of an abortion survivor, Melissa Ohden. And as you look, and as you're impacted by her life, you'll never be the same. So let's watch and let's see Christ in her face. We'll be right back.
Get your coffee, sit down. You don't want to miss this interview. Well, sweet Melissa, welcome to At Home with Jim and Joy.
Good to see the two of you again.
It is good to see you again. Now, I want you to tell our family at home a little bit about who you are, what happened to you, your birth story, and all the things that God has done in your life.
Yeah, I often tell people the story of my life could have been very short, right? Just another life ended by abortion. But God took that story and He expanded it now into this amazing story. I'm a convert to the Catholic Church.
Welcome home.
Thank you. It has been such a blessing to me. And you know, a lot of people know me as a pro-life speaker or an activist and an author. And of course, what led to that is the very grace of God. But I survived a failed abortion 39 years ago. And what I know about those circumstances is that, you know, my birth mother fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. She was a college student. She was 19. She wasn't married to my biological father, even though they were engaged. And, you know, one of the greatest statistics she fits is one that isn't often talked about in our world, and that's coercion and even force. You know, we live in a society that talks about abortion being a choice and a right, but statistics tell us that most women don't report having a choice. And I now know that my birth mother had no choice, It was actually forced upon her by my own grandmother. My maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse in their community, and so this saline infusion abortion was forced upon her. And that type of procedure isn't done routinely anymore, but it was the most common procedure in the 70s. You know, the audience members might remember it. And that procedure was meant to poison me to death in the womb. It would peel away the top layer of skin, scalding the baby, and usually was completed within about 72 hours. And then premature labor was induced with the intent of that child being delivered. In my own circumstances, my medical records actually indicate that I soaked in it not for 3 days, but for 5.
Mercy.
They just kept trying time and time again over those 5 days to induce my birth mother's labor with me. You know, I joked earlier, right? I'm stubborn.
Yes.
God has used that for good.
That's a good stubborn, yes.
Yeah.
But, you know, of course, all kidding aside, the longer I soaked in that toxic salt solution, the greater the likelihood would be that my life was ended. And on that 5th day, I was delivered at a hospital. You know, all of these things were routine, except for what happened next. I was born alive. And as I told some high school students earlier this week, a lot of people call me a dreaded complication of abortion, the child who lives.
Right.
And, you know, I wish I could say that even when I was born alive, people saw the dignity and value in my life, but that didn't happen either. I now know that my grandmother, that nurse, not only forced the abortion upon my birth mother, but she was present when I was delivered. And she actually gave the demand that I be left in the hospital room to die.
Yes.
But I don't fault her for that. You know, I say, first of all, that's what this culture has done, right? Where people could make these kind of decisions about lives like mine every single day. And secondly, no matter what decision she could ever make about my life, you know, you've already touched on the point, Jim, I love her. I think people expect me to be angry or bitter or somehow jaded about this cross, right? This cross that I didn't pick out for myself.
Right.
But I'm not. I'm so thankful to be alive, and I choose to love the people who intended to harm me, because that's how much Christ loves each and every one of us and calls to love other people in return.
Wow.
That's an amazing story, and what the capacity to love. So you were born alive. Your grandmother gives the order that you should die. But then what happened to you next?
God wasn't done, right?
Right.
What was your physical condition from this attempted abortion of your life for a 5-day period and soaking in this chemical? What was your physical health like?
Because I don't look like somebody who was supposed to be poisoned to death in the womb, right?
Right.
And so the reality is the prognosis for my life was actually very guarded initially. I weighed a little less than 3 pounds when I was delivered. I was a whopping 2 pounds, 14 ounces.
At what gestational age were you delivered?
Yeah, the abortionist actually indicated on my medical records that he thought my birth mother was about 18 to 22 weeks pregnant. But the fact that I was able to live and I weighed almost that 3 pounds, they estimate she was probably more like 31 weeks.
Yeah.
Do you think they did that because maybe an abortion at that gestational, in your state at that time, was that illegal? Did they do that for legal purposes to, you know, change the records?
I'll never know
I
the
don't know.
Yeah, I'll never know the answer to that. But you know, I often think about this, especially when it comes to pregnancy centers, right? You use ultrasound to provide a window to the womb, and it changes women's lives, children's lives, to know the truth about life. On the flip side, for me, I think God hid the truth, because the longer I progressed gestationally, the greater my likelihood could be.
Yeah.
So it was guarded condition for you.
It was. It was.
And you don't have people around you that want to save your life, even a relative there. So what was your circumstance in terms of what happens to you?
Yeah, I now know that even though my grandmother made that demand about my life, a nurse actually rushed me from that hospital room off to the NICU. A nurse who was in the NICU that day actually contacted me just recently and was able to share details. And she said that day the door flew open, which was pretty normal for NICU. But she said what came out of the nurse's mouth, you know, it was not normal. She actually shouted, you know, that darn Dr. Kellberg messed up. he was the abortionist. And she went on and she said, she just kept gasping for breath. She just kept gasping for breath, and so I couldn't leave her there to die. And she didn't.
Praise the Lord.
You know, those nurses were some of the first people in my life to love me.
Sure.
And you would never know by looking at me today that I suffered from severe respiratory, liver problems, seizures. The doctors actually thought I had a fatal heart defect because of the way my body was presenting itself. And they didn't think I would live for very long initially. And if I did, I would suffer from multiple disabilities throughout my life. And we live in a society that hears those things.
Sure.
And somehow thinks maybe that's a life that nobody could love. Or maybe that's a life that somebody shouldn't live.
Right.
So how long did you spend in the hospital after this birth?
At that hospital, about 21 days before I was sent to the next hospital.
Okay.
And it was at the next hospital that my parents came into my life.
How did that take place? How did they hear about you?
You know what I love is I was looking through some paperwork recently, and they were on a waiting list for another child. My older sister's adopted from another family, and they were told at the beginning of August of 1977, your home study's updated, but it's going to be a long time before you are up on the list to receive another child. I was born at the end of August, and they got the phone call saying, we have this little girl, would you be willing to travel this distance to meet her? And my parents often tell that story of how the first time they laid eyes on me lying in an incubator full of tubes and wires, fighting for my life, they instantly fell in love with me.
Thank God. And that was the more love that then came around to support you and to love you. I mean, because God had a plan for Melissa's life, right? Who named you?
They did.
They did.
They did, although the nurses named me initially.
Okay.
But my parents named me Melissa after a friend of the family who had gone through some difficulties in her life and had great strength. And so they gave me that name in return. And I like to think I've bore that name well over the years.
Yes, a great fighter.
So they knew the circumstances of your situation, of your birth, and they said, we desire this child. We want this child. Because I know for a lot of people, you know, it would be like, this is just too complicated. I mean, physically, I mean, it's so much, and then who knows emotionally and what's going on here. But all those reasons not to adopt you were kind of reasons for them to have pate cum, compassion, to really, you were like a live wire that you're not supposed to touch, but they grabbed the wire. They got that too, you know, that, what special people.
They are. You know, I always tell people they love me that much still today, despite everything I've put them through in the last 39 years. You know, my parents have been the most incredible support in my life, and I can't imagine anybody but them being my parents.
So you get to go home when? When do you get to go home where they say, she's okay, we can bring her home, she's out of the NICU, she's out of danger?
I was only a few months old when I was sent home to them, which is a pretty miraculous thing 39 years ago, right? And they still, you know, were very cautious about what my life might entail. But I can still remember, I didn't understand it at the time, but I can remember being about 5 years old and going back to that major hospital where I had been cared for. And I remember my parents sobbing. I now know that they were crying because they were told that day that the doctors really thought I had overcome most of the obstacles, and they thought that I was healthy and, you know, I would stay the course.
So,
by the grace of God,
so
right?
the hospital in which the attempt on your life, you went back there 5 years later? Is that what you're saying?
No, so I was born at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, and then I was actually transferred to the University of Iowa Hospitals. And so that's a major hospital for many people. And so that's actually where I went for my follow-up appointment.
Okay. When did you get in touch with your own story? I mean, of what took place?
It wasn't until I was 14. I grew up knowing I was adopted, I was loved, and not just by my parents, my adoptive parents. I grew up knowing my biological parents, loved me. They gave me the gift of life and the gift of my family. That's how my parents raised my older sister and I, to know that adoption meant that we were deeply loved.
Right.
And I am so thankful for that, because I didn't question that for a second growing up, that my birth parents loved me.
Yeah.
Until I was 14.
Right. And then what happened when you were 14?
the truth about my survival came slipping out of the seams. My older sister had faced an unplanned pregnancy herself, and in the midst of that, as a teenager, our parents decided to tell her the story of my survival, hoping that she could understand just how deep of a decision she was facing in her life. And, you know, I'm so thankful that no matter how scared she was, she knew that our parents would support her and love her. And she carried her son and parented him, had other children. But in the midst of that, that's how the story came trickling down to me.
Right. And that was shock to you.
Shock and awe.
Right. And so then did you go to your parents and say, okay, is this true what she just said, and you wanted the real story?
I did. You know, my sister didn't tell me everything. I don't think I would have believed her.
Right.
But I did ask our parents, you know, to explain to me why she would say the things that she did. And, you know, I often tell people what my mom had to say that night 25 years ago is something that no parent should ever have to say. She said, Missy, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it. And there's honestly no words. You know, I've been working through this for 25 years, and at least I can now tell that story without sobbing.
Right, absolutely.
But it was every bit as devastating as my parents were afraid it was going to be.
Yeah. I mean, you must have been disoriented, you know, being told something like that, right? Because you're just thinking, this is my life as best I understand it, and being here, and now you're saying this. Did you have any inklings about anything growing up, or there's no recall of anything, or, and then this was told to you, and then you've got to orient yourself?
Yeah, being 14, I think it's hard enough to try to figure out who you are.
Right.
And then you think you know, and then suddenly you're not who you thought you were.
Right. And that's really scary. Because then you're saying, what else haven't you told me? And who are you people? I mean, everything comes into question.
Well, and who am I? I mean, that was my greatest
Yes.
question. Like, who am I really? And as we think about entering into Holy Week, you know, I always remind people, we don't get to pick our crosses, right? Or we go, I've got one and I'm good.
Yeah, right.
You know? And I always tell people, this is not the cross I would have picked for myself.
Right.
But I am now so thankful for it because it's changed my life, and really humbling myself has made that cross not only bearable, but it's a blessing to me.
Right. But that's the beauty of the gospel, is that here, like you said, who wants this? You couldn't make this up. But then with the grace, but then the purpose that it gives you, it says, Melissa, yes, this was a terrible thing that happened to you, but trust me, believe in me, and I'm going to use this for good in your life and in you. I can't, thousands upon thousands of people that God has given you an opportunity to speak to, and what you have done for the pro-life movement and what for the pro-abortion movement, how they must detest the presence of you, because you are what they tried to destroy. You know, and it's like, and there you are caught in this place. You know?
I want to, the thing of who am I, you know, when you're hearing it, it's just so huge, because it is your image, and who am I? I mean, that firmness within yourself, and then all of a sudden, you know, what you did think, this is like, there's little fissures in all of this. So what course did you take, you know, as you went down the road? Was it, you know, how did you look for yourself, or how did you find yourself, or how did you try and find affirmation, or what took place? Was it a disastrous road?
It was a bumpy road. I'll be the first person to admit that. You know, I was kind of that typical, I mean, even before that, I was a people pleaser, right? I always wanted to make my family happy. I never wanted to disappoint anybody. That's who I am. But when I found out the truth about my life, I spiraled. You know, I felt such incredible pain. And especially when we live in a culture that doesn't show a lot of respect for the unborn and doesn't have a lot of positive things to say about people like me. You know, people say things not knowing what somebody else has gone through. And so I would hear all of these hateful, painful things. And so I was ashamed and embarrassed initially. I felt guilty for surviving because I kept thinking, why me? Right? And I was angry. I was angry initially. And I think what I did was I turned that anger inward. And I hated myself. And so I developed an eating disorder. I struggled with alcohol abuse. My family had no idea. That's so hard for my parents. You know, I think it's hard for any parent. But my parents had wanted to save me from suffering.
Right.
And of course, the truth brought about this suffering, but it was part of the process that I had to work through. And, you know, the beauty in that is that it now helps me understand the suffering that everybody goes through and how we all make mistakes. We're all sinners.
Right.
We stumble. And I just happened to be 14 and in a lot of pain. So I understand mine. But in the midst of that, the beauty is that God really saved me from myself.
Well, Melissa, it's been such a powerful time of sharing, and maybe you could just bring us up to the contemporary time of just how you're doing, your family, works that you're involved with that are of special interest for you that you want us to know.
Yeah, you know, often people say, well, where do you go from here? And I always just simply say, every single day, I hope to just fulfill God's will. So I never know what tomorrow is going to bring. But what I do know is, you know, right now we have 2 little girls. One is almost 9 and the other is 2.5.
Beautiful.
And my husband and I live in the Kansas City area with our daughters. We're so blessed. And part of the work I do, in addition to speaking and writing, is work with other survivors. You know, I spent many years of my life feeling very alone. And that was really hard for me. And so when I found out Gianna Jessen existed, that gave me some strength. And then what I found as I traveled is that I gave other people strength in return, because I would get emails and messages from people who would say, I'm a survivor too. And I always thought I was the only one.
How many have you been in touch with?
210 other survivors or their family members who communicate.
Just that you know of.
Yeah, and so we actually know that the number is much greater than that. I wish there was a fast and hard number we could get to. But what I could say is that this happens more often than what anybody can imagine or talks about.
And it has to mean so much for you to get with people that have experienced what you've experienced, and same thing with them, and some are further down the road. I guess they need a lot of encouragement and healing.
Absolutely. Yeah, most survivors, just simply knowing that they're not alone has been the biggest piece for them. But yeah, we, through the Abortion Survivors Network, connect people with local resources in their community if they need to find healing, if they want opportunities to serve, to make a difference in people's lives. And we provide them with the opportunity to share their story. Not everybody is going to be called to do what they do with their story. But I want everybody to have that opportunity to share their story if that's what they want to do.
You've also done some work in the area of post-abortion healing for those who suffer after abortion and realize, hey, you know, maybe I thought this was the right thing to do, but it's created a whole nother set of problems. And what have you done in that area? What do you want to say to women who have had abortions?
I want everybody to know that there is hope and healing and love and forgiveness to be found after an abortion. I think people maybe think an abortion survivor would be angry or condemning, judgmental, and I'm here to tell you I am anything but that. I am probably one of the most loving, understanding people that anybody would ever find, because I understand the suffering that comes with abortion, even though I was on this other end of it. So I want people to desperately know that places like Project Rachel, Rachel's Vineyard, Silent No More, going to their local pregnancy center for post-abortion healing, whether it's in a group or one-on-one, you know, there are so many great opportunities for people to find healing in their own lives.
Yeah, and people can go to optionline.org, optionline.org, if they're in a crisis pregnancy or if they need post-abortion healing, and they can get them the resources that they need. Just a final word from you, straight from your heart, as we go into Holy Week and God's message to people at this time.
That it's such an important time to be grateful. You know, to live with that gratitude every single day. I do not take my life for granted. I don't take the sufferings and the trials for granted, and I see the blessing in the midst of that. And it has changed my life to have that perspective. And so I want that for everyone. And so especially as we enter into Holy Week, I would just love for people to take that opportunity to look upon their life and see the blessing that exists in both the trials and the tribulations.
And the beautiful words to say, like Jesus said on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. If you're an abortion survivor, if you're a woman that had an abortion, family members that forced that whole act, and even for abortion providers.
Yes.
And those that are in the clinics, is to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, in this great year of mercy, to extend that.
Well, Melissa Ohden, thank you so much for sharing your story, for being part of the EWTN family. We treasure what you've shared. We cherish you, and it is beautiful that you exist.
Hallelujah. Well, we hope you were blessed by Melissa's remarkable story. Be sure to tune in Wednesday's show when Bobby Schindler, he will join us to talk about the end of life issues. It will be a great show. Remember, you're always at home with Jim and Joy. Keep it on EWTN. Bye now.